And so in this gospel narrative, there are times when we come up with this question of should we compromise our message and our calling? Sometimes we can see why God was doing something, but other times we can't see why God is challenging us in a situation. And what happens when we can't see God's wisdom in something? We try and find wisdom. And the way that we try and find wisdom is not always by trusting God. The way that we try and find wisdom sometimes is by trusting our own wisdom and thinking, what would be the most sensible thing to do? Now that's perfectly natural, that's perfectly ordinary, but sometimes God has called us to the roller coaster and to not understand fully what's going on. Does that mean we shouldn't question things? No. Does that mean that we shouldn't search out for an answer? No. Does that mean that we shouldn't think wisely and shouldn't be careful? No. But what it does mean is that sometimes when we have made a commitment to God to stand up for something, we stick to it and we don't compromise because we have made a commitment to God to stand up for something. The wisdom is in the commitment, not in the circumstances changing around us. And so here's Paul, and he finds himself in prison. And he's analyzing things. He's analyzing things for two reasons. One, because others analyze us. You see, how many of you recognize, even in your own workplaces, people analyzing you? How well are they doing about this? And do they actually live what they say they do? And I thought you were a Christian and you swore. And all of these things, and you're being analysed all the time. You're constantly on a driving test. It's horrible being on a driving test. Some of you have got to look forward to your driving tests. Okay? For those of you that have forgotten what a driving test was about, just remember the times when you're driving along the road and suddenly the blue lights are behind you and you wonder if it's you. And suddenly the hands go to the 10 and 2 position and you drive that and you check your mirrors and everything else and you're signaling, maneuvering and everything. And you're doing everything as best you possibly can to make sure that you're not the one that's in trouble. Yeah? And it's the same in the driving test. You're being looked at, people are monitoring, people are aware of you. How many of us like being monitored at work? How many of us like the Ofsted inspections? How many of us like to have somebody that peruses over our family life and saying, well, you could be a better mother if you do that, or you could be a better father if you do that? How many of us like the monitoring situation? Very, very few of us like the monitoring situation. But Paul is analyzing himself. Why? Because his circumstances have changed. His circumstances are inhibiting the gospel, or they seem to be. See, from man's wisdom, his circumstances are that he can no longer preach like he used to be. He can no longer go where he used to go. He's no longer free to spread the gospel in the way he did. But he has to come to a realization that the gospel is not dependent on what he can do to fulfill it. The gospel is not dependent on my ability or your ability. The gospel is not dependent on how free we are to speak about it. The gospel does not depend on man. Although it has been entrusted to him, it doesn't depend on him. Because ultimately it belongs to God, it belongs to the Son, it belongs to the Spirit. And the Spirit will find a way. So one of the things Paul is illustrating through this is that his trust and his level of faith is not built in his circumstances. And he's not built purely in a blind trust of the doctor knows what they're doing, but is built on a realization that no matter where he finds himself or what he ends up being imprisoned with or suffering with, that the gospel will continue to grow and continue. And so his eyes are looking for that. His eyes are looking for where is God moving, what is God doing, what is God able to do outside of my circumstances. And he finds it. He finds it because the cause of Christ has become well known throughout the whole Praetorian Guard. Praetorian Guard were the emperor's guards. So he's in the house of Caesar. He's actually in Rome, in the house of Caesar, and the emperor's guards are the ones that he's shackled with. The chances are he's under house arrest and he's actually chained to a Roman soldier. And so for the last 2 years, which is the context of what's been going on here, he has been chained to a Roman soldier and he's been sharing with everybody. Now we know from other parts of the New Testament that actually there were some Christians within Caesar's household. So the chances are that some of the people he was ministering to actually became Christians as a consequence of his ministry within that local area. And it teaches us something about where we find ourselves. See, you may not be in the place you'd hoped you'd be. You know, we all have plans. What am I going to be doing in 5 years' time? I asked Miles that question the other day. So what are you going to be in 5 years' time? 5 years' time, Miles? He said, I don't know. Have you ever done these things at work where you ask yourself, where are you going to be? What do you want to do in 5 years' time? I found that really hard to answer. I don't know. I'm a bit like I want the adventure and I want the unknown sometimes. But some of us like to have a 15-year plan, don't we? Where you know where you're going to be then, and you've got that, and I want to climb the ladder and get to this point here, and I've got that. Often university is the kind of way, you come out of school and you think, right, I'm going to do university for 3 years, and then I want to get this job, and then I want to go there, and I want to go there. You end up with this 5-year plan. But what happens if your 5-year plan is completely scuppered within 3 years and you know you're never going to get there? And so Paul's thinking is having to shift, and he's having to find a way to minister to the people around him wherever he finds himself. And that is the ministry of the gospel coming out in his own life. And so for Paul, he was bringing all sorts of people to Christ where he was. So the reason he's writing this is not so he can feel better. The reason he's writing this is because the people in Philippi were looking to Paul as an example of what it is to minister the gospel and the power of the gospel ministering through a person. So the reason Paul's writing this is not to save Paul's face. We know that later on, and I'll speak about that later. The reason he's writing it is so that people can realize that the gospel's still working, and the gospel still has a hold on me, and a hold on my circumstances, and a hold on my life. He's basically saying this: you may see prison, you may see limitation, you may see a lack of opportunity. You may see things going wrong around you. You may see sickness. You may see a relationship breakdown. You may see a disaster and a train wreck or something like that. You may see cultural breakdown. You may see suffering. You may see wrongdoing and things going on. But the gospel is still advancing. I see the Praetorian Guards responding to Christ. I see people in Caesar's household coming to know him. I see that the people of influence underneath the spheres of governance are beginning to rise up. And we know, because there's a fascinating story later on in the martyrdom stories. And there was one I read where there was this guy, and he stood up. He was a kind of a Roman court guy, and he was found to be a Christian. And he was stood up in front of these judges, and the judges said, "Are you a Christian?" And he said, "Yes, I am. I'm a man of truth. It is true. I'm a Christian." And they sentenced him to death on the spot. They said, "Well, you will burn." And so then what happened is fascinating. Somebody from the crowd said, "Sir, that's unfair. What wrong has he done?" And so they turned around to this person who they knew, and they said, "Well, he's a Christian. He deserves to die." They said, "Why are you asking this question? Are you a Christian too?" At which point he said, "Yes, I am." And so they said, "Well, you will die with him then." And so then he stood out and stood next to this guy, and they were both sentenced to death. And this guy on the right said, "This is victory for me because Christ will be glorified in this." And what was really interesting is the next thing that happened. Somebody else in the crowd said, "I'm a Christian too, you might as well put me in with it." And they all went to their deaths. Fascinating that it would have been people from Caesar's household. It would have been people Paul ministered to. Now, I was stunned by this. I don't know about you. I don't know if I have that level of faith. Really don't. I was totally stunned by reading it.